My arrogant friend bet that I couldn't survive outside my comfort zone. So I married a woman who changed everything. You ever have one of those moments where your pride gets the best of you? Like, you know deep down you should walk away, but something in you refuses to back down? That is exactly how I ended up in the most insane situation of my life, married to a woman I barely knew. All because my so-called friend dared me to do it. It started on a typical Friday night at the Skyline Lounge, one of those exclusive spots in Chicago where people with too much money gather to pretend they're interesting. I was in my usual place, corner booth, whiskey in hand, listening to another round of self-congratulatory nonsense from the people I surrounded myself with. Deals were being made over overpriced drinks, and everyone was competing to see who could brag the hardest. Then there was Richard Weston, my longest-standing rival and the only person who knew exactly how to push my buttons. We had been competing since college, business, success, women, you name it. Our friendship was built on a foundation of one-upmanship. And that night was no different. You know what your problem is, Alex, Richard said, swirling the wine in his glass like he was about to deliver some world-changing wisdom. You only operate in spaces where you have control. You never take real risks. I scoffed. That is because I do not need to. Control is what keeps me on top. Right, he said, smirking. Which is why every woman you have ever dated looks like she was plucked straight out of a fashion magazine and trained to smile at all the right times. I raised an eyebrow, already feeling the trap he was setting. And what is wrong with knowing what I like? Richard leaned in, lowering his voice just enough to make it sound like he was letting me in on some great secret. It is boring, Alex. Predictable. You play life like a chessboard, moving pieces around, but never letting anything happen that you cannot control. What if, for once, you stepped into a situation where you had no power? I should have ignored him. I should have laughed it off and moved on. But something about the way he said it, the sheer confidence in his voice, made my blood boil. And what exactly are you proposing? I asked, setting my glass down, knowing full well I was about to do something stupid. Richard grinned, like he had been waiting for me to ask. A bet. Find someone completely outside your world. Someone who does not fit your perfect, polished life. Marry her. 6 months. No loopholes. No backing out. The idea was ridiculous, absurd, insulting, even. But there was also something about it that intrigued me. Maybe it was the challenge. Maybe it was the fact that Richard genuinely believed I could not do it. Or maybe, deep down, I was just tired of living a life where I always knew exactly how everything was going to play out. So, like an idiot, I shook his hand. And that is how it all began. The moment I shook Richard's hand, I knew there was no turning back. It was not just about the money. Though the $75 million investment was tempting, it was about proving him wrong. Proving that I could step outside my carefully curated life and still come out on top. But I was not naive. I knew that if I was going to win this bet, I needed a strategy. Marrying someone completely different from me was not just a challenge, it was a calculated move. I did not believe for a second that love or compatibility mattered in marriage. I believed in control, and if I could turn even the most unpredictable situation into something manageable, I would win. The next morning, I called my assistant, Victoria. She had been working for me for nearly a decade, and if there was anyone who could discreetly find me a suitable candidate, it was her. I need a list, I said as I sipped my morning coffee, staring out at the Chicago skyline from my penthouse. Victoria did not even flinch. A list of what, exactly? Woman outside my usual circle, I said. Someone who does not fit the world I live in. No models, no corporate elites, no socialites. Someone completely different. She narrowed her eyes slightly. You are serious about this, aren't you? I smirked. Dead serious. She sighed, already typing on her tablet. Give me a few days. I will find you some options. Victoria did not ask why I needed this. And that was one of the reasons I trusted her. She handled my business without unnecessary questions. And I knew she would deliver. By the end of the week, she handed me a file. Here are some potential candidates. I focused on women with strong personalities. Since I assume you do not want someone who will make this too easy for you. I flipped through the profiles with a detached curiosity. Each name was accompanied by a short background: teachers, nurses, Small business owners. None of them stood out. Until I saw her. Camille Johnson, 37 years old, Latina, founder of a struggling youth center on the South Side. A former social worker turned activist. Not conventionally glamorous, but striking in a way that suggested strength rather than polish. She did not come from money, had no ties to high society, and, judging by the notes in Victoria's file, had a reputation for being stubborn and impossible to intimidate. I said, tapping the page, set up a meeting. Victoria glanced at the file and arched an eyebrow. You sure? She is not going to be easily impressed by your usual charm. I smirked. Good. I do not need to impress her. I just need her to say yes. As I closed the file, I felt the first flicker of something unfamiliar. It was not doubt. I never doubted myself. But for the first time in a long time, I was stepping into a situation where I had no idea how things would unfold. And strangely, I liked it. Arranging a meeting with Camille Johnson was easier said than done. Unlike the people in my world, she was not eager to meet a billionaire for a business opportunity. Victoria had reached out under the pretense of discussing potential funding for her youth center. But even then, Camille had been skeptical. She doesn't trust you, Victoria told me bluntly as we rode the elevator down to my office that morning. Took some convincing to get her to agree to a meeting. She thinks you're just another rich man trying to throw money at a problem for a tax break. I smirked, amused by the thought. Then I guess I'll have to prove her wrong. When Camille walked into my office, I was immediately struck by her presence. She was nothing like the women I was used to. She wore a fitted blazer over a plain blouse, her dark hair falling in natural curls around her shoulders. No designer labels, no pretentious air about her. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her sharp brown eyes scanning the room like she was sizing me up. Mr. Harrington, she said, extending a hand. Her voice was steady, professional, but there was a guarded edge to it. Camille, I said, shaking her hand firmly. Please, have a seat. She did, but not before glancing around my office as if she was assessing the kind of man I was by my surroundings. I could already tell she had no patience for small talk, so I got straight to the point. I read about your work at the youth center. It's impressive, I said. You've built something meaningful, despite the lack of funding and resources. She crossed her arms, tilting her head slightly. And what exactly do you want from me? Mr. Harrington? Your assistant said you were interested in helping. But I have a feeling this isn't just a charitable donation. Smart. She was already looking for the catch. You're right, I admitted. I do have a proposal. One that could benefit both of us. Her expression remained unreadable, but I could tell she was listening. I want you to marry me, I said, watching her reaction carefully. For a second, Camille just blinked, like she was waiting for the punchline. Then, she laughed, a short, disbelieving sound. Excuse me? She said, leaning forward. It's a business arrangement, I continued calmly. I'll provide significant funding to your center, enough to expand, hire more staff, upgrade facilities. In exchange, we stay married for 6 months. After that, you walk away with full financial security for your work. Her eyes narrowed. And why would I do that? You don't have to, I said with a casual shrug. But if you do, you'll be able to help a lot more kids than you can right now. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head. This is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard. It's also the best deal you're going to get, I said, my tone even. Think about it. She studied me, her expression unreadable. Then, after a long pause, she said, I'll need time. I smiled. Take all the time you need. Just don't take too long. I had a feeling Camille Johnson was not the type to be easily swayed. And for the first time in a long time, I was genuinely intrigued. Camille did not take too long to decide, but I could tell she wanted to make me wait. A full week passed before she finally agreed to meet again. I had half expected her to turn me down outright, but something about my offer must have stuck with her. When she walked into my office for the second time, she carried herself with the same confidence. But this time there was something else, a sense of control. Like she was the one calling the shots. She sat down, folded her hands in her lap, and looked me dead in the eye. I'll do it, she said, her tone flat, unreadable. I raised an eyebrow. That easy? Not exactly. She leaned forward. I have conditions. Of course. She did. I leaned back in my chair, amused. Let's hear them. First, she said, ticking off her fingers. This marriage is strictly business. No expectations beyond what's necessary for public appearances. Second, I keep my independence. You don't get to interfere with my work, my decisions, or my life outside of whatever ridiculous social obligations this requires. And third, she paused, as if weighing her words carefully. Every cent of the money you give me for the youth center goes directly to the programs. No strings, no suggestions on how I should run things. I smirked. You think I'd try to control you? I think men like you don't usually do anything without wanting something in return. She said bluntly. That made me laugh. She was not wrong, but she did not know me well enough yet. Fair enough, I said. Agreed. She studied me, as if waiting for me to slip up, to reveal some hidden agenda. But there was no trick. The bet was simple. Marry someone outside my world and stay married for 6 months. And Camille? She was as far from my world as it got. After a long pause, she sighed. All right, then, let's get this over with. Just like that, we had a deal. Of course, putting it on paper was another thing entirely. I had my legal team draft up an airtight contract, one that ensured Camille would receive full financial security for her youth center, while also outlining the public appearances we would need to maintain for credibility. She had her own lawyer look it over, and I was impressed by how thoroughly she scrutinized every detail. This is the part where I ask if you're having second thoughts, I said when she handed the contract back. Signed and sealed. She rolled her eyes. I don't back out of things once I've made a decision. Good. Neither did I. The wedding was scheduled within the month. I did not expect Camille to care much about the details. But I was wrong. She refused the designer dresses, the extravagant guest list, the over-the-top venue. If this is just for show, she said, then we keep it simple. I had to admit, I respected that. She was not going to make this easy for me. And for the first time, I was starting to wonder if I had underestimated her. The wedding day arrived faster than I expected. And true to her word, Camille kept it simple. No lavish ballroom, no celebrity guest list, no designer gown that cost more than a car. Instead, we stood in a modest courthouse with only a handful of witnesses, Victoria, a few of Camille's close friends from the youth center, and Richard, who watched the entire event with a smirk, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Camille wore a simple ivory dress. Nothing extravagant, but it suited her. She looked strong, composed, completely unfazed by the absurdity of the situation. Meanwhile, I was dressed in a tailored suit, polished as ever, standing next to a woman who made it very clear that she was not here to be impressed. When the officiant asked if we took each other in marriage, I said, I do, without hesitation. This was a deal, and I never backed out of a deal. Camille, on the other hand, paused for half a second longer than necessary before responding. I do. She was making a point. This was not romantic, not emotional, just business. After we signed the papers and officially became husband and wife, Camille turned to me and extended a hand. Not for a kiss, not for an embrace, just a firm, professional handshake. Congratulations, Mr. Harrington, she said, her voice dry. I smirked and shook her hand. Likewise, Mrs. Harrington. Richard was the first to approach us afterward, raising a glass of champagne with amusement written all over his face. I have to admit, Alex, I didn't think you'd go through with it. I took a sip of my own drink. Then you should know by now. Richard, I never lose. His smirk deepened. We'll see about that. After the ceremony, we returned to my penthouse, where Camille would now be living. Of course, she made it clear from the start that this was nothing more than a place to sleep. She had already staked out the guest bedroom as her own, leaving no room for misinterpretation. I'm not here to play house, she said as she tossed her suitcase onto the bed. I'll do what's necessary for public appearances. But beyond that, my life stays exactly the way it was before this marriage. I leaned against the doorframe, watching her with amusement. You don't have to keep reminding me. Camille, I know the terms of our agreement. She gave me a skeptical look, as if she was waiting for me to slip up, to reveal some hidden intention. But I had nothing to hide. At least, not yet. The first few days were interesting. Camille moved through my world like she was visiting a foreign country, polite, distant, Unimpressed, she refused my invitations to business events, ignored the high-end fashion Victoria offered her, and continued spending her days at the youth center as if nothing had changed. She was determined to keep herself separate from me, and for some reason, I could not stop watching her. At first, our lives barely overlapped. Camille treated my penthouse like a hotel, a place to sleep before she went back to the world she actually cared about. She left early every morning for the youth center and came back late. Always exhausted but satisfied, like she had spent the day doing something meaningful. I, on the other hand, carried on as usual. My days were filled with meetings, negotiations, and the never-ending race to stay ahead in the business world. I had expected some level of discomfort in this arrangement, but Camille surprised me. She did not try to adapt to my world, nor did she resent it. She simply existed outside of it, unaffected. That, in itself, was a first. Most people either admired me or feared me. Camille did neither. She made that clear a week into our marriage when I invited her to a high-profile gala. It was one of those charity events where the city's wealthiest gathered to pretend they cared about something other than themselves. "You should come," I told her as we sat in the kitchen one evening. It was the first real conversation we had attempted since the wedding. She barely looked up from the grant application she was reviewing. "And why would I do that?" "Because it's part of the deal," I said, leaning against the counter. "Public appearances, remember?" She sighed and finally set down her pen. "I do charity work every day. I don't need to dress up and sip overpriced champagne to feel good about it." I smirked. "It's not about feeling good. It's about influence. These events raise millions because the right people attend. You could make connections, find potential donors." She studied me for a moment before shaking her head. "I don't need connections who only give when cameras are watching." That was the first time she genuinely irritated me. Not because she refused to go, but because she dismissed something I had mastered my entire life. "You don't get it," I said, pushing off the counter. "Money moves through power. You want real funding? You have to play the game." Her eyes narrowed. "And that's exactly why I don't trust your world." That was it. No argument, no long-winded explanation, just a quiet, unwavering refusal to compromise. And, as much as I hated to admit it, I respected that. So, I went to the gala alone. As expected, but for the first time, I found myself distracted. The polished smiles, the rehearsed speeches, the empty conversations, it all felt hollow. I had been attending these events for years, but now, something about them felt artificial. The next morning, I saw Camille heading out the door with a bag full of supplies for the youth center. "You're really not going to play the game at all, are you?" I asked. She smirked over her shoulder. "No, Alex, I'm going to change the game." And just like that, I knew. This bet was going to be more difficult than I had ever imagined. I had underestimated her. At first, I thought Camille's resistance was just part of her personality, stubborn, independent, unwilling to be controlled. But as the days turned into weeks, I realized it was more than that. She was not just rejecting my world, she was actively challenging it. She refused every invitation to high society gatherings, ignored every luxury I offered her, and, most frustratingly, she did not seem even slightly impressed by the wealth surrounding her. That should not have bothered me. I did not care about winning people over, except, for some reason, with Camille, I did. One evening, after yet another event where I had to explain my wife's absence to questioning investors, I came home to find her in the living room, sorting through donation receipts for the youth center. She had her hair tied back, wearing one of her usual plain t-shirts, completely focused on her work. I leaned against the doorway, watching her for a moment. "You know," I said, breaking the silence, "most people in your position would take advantage of this situation." She did not even look up. "What situation?" I gestured vaguely. "Living in a penthouse, married to a billionaire. They'd be taking weekend trips to Paris, wearing designer clothes, enjoying the benefits." Camille smirked and finally met my gaze. "If I wanted that life, I wouldn't have built everything I have from scratch." Her confidence was infuriating. "So, you're saying you wouldn't mind going back to struggling for funding every month?" I challenged. She sat back in her chair, folding her arms. "I've been doing it for years. At least I know it's real." Her words sat between us, heavier than I expected. "For years, I had measured success in numbers, profits, investments, acquisitions. Camille measured success in impact, in the lives she changed. And somehow, despite the fact that I had more power, more wealth, and more influence than she could ever dream of, she still made me feel like she was winning. You really think money means nothing? I asked, genuinely curious now. She exhaled, shaking her head. Money isn't the problem, Alex. It's what people do with it. People like you use it to build walls. People like me use it to break them down. That hit me harder than I cared to admit. She was not naive. She understood money was necessary. But she saw it differently. It was not a tool for power, it was a tool for change. For the first time, I wondered what would happen if I started seeing it that way too. I did not say anything else that night, but as I watched her return to her work, completely uninterested in my wealth, my name, or my world, I realized something that unsettled me more than I expected. I was starting to care about what she thought. And that was dangerous. I was not supposed to care. This marriage had been a transaction, a strategic move to win a bet and prove a point. That was it, but Camille was making it harder than I expected. It was not just that she refused to be impressed by my world. It was the way she moved through it with complete disregard, as if she was immune to everything that held value to me. The penthouse, the wealth, the power, none of it mattered to her. And the more I watched her, the more I started wondering if maybe, just maybe, she had the right idea. I did not like that. So, I did what I always did when something made me uncomfortable. I tried to regain control. One afternoon, I had Victoria arrange a meeting between Camille and one of my business associates. A man who donated millions every year to education programs. He had the resources to help her youth center expand beyond anything she had ever imagined. All she had to do was sit down, listen, and accept the opportunity I had handed her. She showed up to the meeting. But the moment she realized what it was, she turned to me with a look of irritation. "This isn't how I do things, Alex," she said under her breath before shaking the man's hand and sitting down. I watched as she listened to his proposal, nodding at all the right moments. But I could see the tension in her posture. She was polite, professional, but distant. The meeting ended, and as soon as we stepped outside, she turned to me. "Don't ever do that again." I raised an eyebrow. "Do what? Connect you with someone who could help?" She exhaled sharply, clearly frustrated. "You don't get it. I don't take money from people who don't care. I don't need investors who see my work as a way to boost their public image. I need people who believe in what we're doing." I frowned. "Money is money, Camille. What does it matter where it comes from?" She stared at me, almost disappointed. "That's exactly the problem with your world. It's never about the cause, it's about the transaction. I won't let my center become someone's PR move." I should have been annoyed. Instead, I felt something I had not felt in years. Doubt. For the first time, I wondered if the way I had always done things, the way I had built my entire empire, was as untouchable as I had always believed. Camille did not wait for my response. She simply walked away, leaving me standing there, watching her disappear into the crowd. I had meant to show her that my way was better, that power and wealth could make things happen faster, easier. But instead, she had made me question everything I thought I knew. And that realization unsettled me more than I was willing to admit. I could not shake what Camille had said. For days, her words replayed in my mind. "It's never about the cause, it's about the transaction." That was how she saw my world. Cold, calculated, transactional. And the worst part? She was not wrong. For years, I had prided myself on being the man who could close any deal, who could turn any situation into a strategic advantage. I had built my empire on that mindset. But Camille had exposed a crack in that foundation. And now I could not ignore it. That was a problem. So, I did what I always did when faced with something uncomfortable. I buried myself in work. Meetings, acquisitions, deals, anything to remind myself of who I was and why I did not need to care about what Camille thought. But even in my office, surrounded by the wealth and power I had spent my life building, I felt off. Then, one afternoon, Victoria walked in with a file and a raised eyebrow. "You've been acting strange," she said, dropping the folder on my desk. I glanced up from my laptop. "Strange?" "Yes," she said, sitting across from me. You haven't been to any social events in weeks. You've stopped taking certain calls. And, she gestured to the untouched scotch on my desk. You aren't drinking nearly as much. I smirked. And that concerns you? It concerns me when you start caring about something that isn't business. She said bluntly. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands. And what exactly do you think I care about? She tilted her head. Camille. I exhaled slowly. This was a bet. Victoria. Sure, she said, unimpressed. And yet, here you are, sitting in this office like a man trying to convince himself he hasn't already lost. That irritated me, not because she was wrong, but because I hated being so transparent. I glanced at the folder she had brought in. What's this? A full breakdown of Camille's youth center. She said, donations, staff salaries, pending grant applications, the works. I frowned. Why are you bringing this to me? Victoria sighed. Because you're going to do something about it. And I figured I'd save you the trouble of pretending you weren't already planning to. I stared at the folder, knowing she was right. That night, I did something I never would have done before meeting Camille. I went to the youth center, alone. No security, no assistance, just me. And what I saw changed everything. I saw her in action, helping kids with homework, speaking to exhausted single mothers, fixing a broken bookshelf in the corner of the room with nothing but a screwdriver and determination. She did not see me at first, but when she did, her expression shifted from surprise to something unreadable. What are you doing here? She asked. I had no answer. For the first time in my life, I had stepped into something without a plan. And for the first time, I did not care. Camille looked at me like I did not belong there. And to be fair, I probably did not. I stood in the middle of the youth center, surrounded by chipped walls, mismatched chairs, and kids who barely gave me a passing glance. This was her world, messy, imperfect, real. I had spent my entire life in places designed to impress. Boardrooms, penthouses, 5-star hotels. But here, no one cared about who I was. No one whispered my name or tried to get in my good graces. I was just another stranger in a place where money meant nothing if it was not backed by action. Camille crossed her arms, watching me carefully. You didn't answer my question. I shrugged, glancing around. I wanted to see what you've built. She narrowed her eyes. Why? I sighed, knowing I had no real excuse. Because I needed to. She did not look convinced. But instead of arguing, she turned and walked toward the supply closet, motioning for me to follow. I did. Inside, she grabbed a few cans of paint and shoved one into my hands. If you're going to stand around, you might as well make yourself useful. I stared at the can, then at her. You want me to paint? Unless you'd rather mop, she said, raising an eyebrow. Up to you, billionaire. I smirked. Fine, painting it is. For the next hour, I did something I had not done in years, manual labor. I rolled paint over a wall that had seen better days while Camille worked beside me. Barely speaking, the silence was not uncomfortable, though it was grounding. Occasionally, kids ran past us, laughing, chasing each other, completely unaware that I had spent years building a world where people scrambled just to get 5 minutes of my time. This was normal to Camille, but to me, it was new. At some point, she glanced over and smirked. You missed a spot. I looked at the wall. No, I didn't. She dipped her brush in paint and flicked it at me, hitting the sleeve of my dress shirt. I stared at the stain, then at her. Camille bit her lip, trying, and failing, not to laugh. Oops. I exhaled slowly, rolled my brush in paint, and flicked it right back at her, catching her on the cheek. Her eyes widened. Oh, you're in trouble now. And just like that, the air between us shifted. The tension, the resistance, it all cracked for a brief moment as she flicked more paint at me. And I did the same. Until we were both a mess. For the first time in weeks, Camille was not looking at me like I was the enemy. For the first time, I was not looking at her like she was a challenge to win. We were just two people, standing in the middle of her world, covered in paint and something dangerously close to laughter. And for the first time since this bet started, I was not sure who was winning anymore. That night, after I left the youth center, I could not stop thinking about Camille. Not in the way I had thought about women in the past. She was not a puzzle to solve. Not a prize to win. not a challenge to conquer. No, this was different. It was the way she looked at the world. The way she fought for things that had nothing to do with power or prestige. The way she had looked at me, not with admiration, not with fear, but as if she was waiting to see if I would finally get it. And for the first time, I wondered if maybe, just maybe, I did. But if there was one thing I knew about Camille, it was that she did not trust easily. The moment she thought I was getting too close, she would push me away, and I could not let that happen. So, I did what I had never done before. I played the long game without a clear end goal. I started showing up to the youth center, not just to write checks, but to actually be there. I helped organize supplies, assisted with events, even sat in on a tutoring session once. I was completely out of my element, but I did it anyway. At first, Camille was suspicious. "What are you doing here again?" she asked one afternoon. Arms crossed. I smirked. "Helping." She rolled her eyes. "Rich men don't just help without an agenda." I leaned against the doorway, watching her. Maybe I just want to see what all the fuss is about. She did not believe me. Not at first, but I kept showing up. And slowly, the way she looked at me started to change. One evening, as we were locking up the center, I walked her to her car. Something I had done a dozen times before. But this time, as she reached for the door handle, she hesitated. "Why are you really doing this?" she asked, her voice softer than usual. I could have lied, could have told her it was all about the bet, that I was just fulfilling the terms. But that was not the truth anymore. I exhaled, running a hand through my hair. "Because I want to." She studied me, searching for the lie. When she did not find one, she nodded once, like she had finally accepted that maybe, just maybe, I was not as predictable as she had thought. And then, in the smallest of moments, something shifted. She smiled, not a smirk, not an amused look at my expense. A real, honest smile. And just like that, I knew I was in trouble. Because this was not about winning anymore. Somewhere along the way, without even realizing it, I had started losing my control, losing the careful walls I had built around my life. And for the first time, I was not sure if I even wanted them back. I had never been afraid of losing before. Losing deals, losing bets, losing control, it was all part of the game. Something I had mastered over the years. But this was different. Because losing to Camille did not feel like losing at all. Somewhere in the past few months, this arrangement had stopped being about the bet. It had stopped being about proving Richard wrong. About proving that I could adapt to any situation and still come out on top. It had become something else entirely. I was not just showing up at the youth center for appearances anymore. I was showing up because I wanted to. Because it felt real. Because, for the first time in my life, I was doing something that was not about profits, power, or winning. And the more I changed, the more Camille let her guard down. It was in the little things. The way she started texting me updates about the youth center, even when she did not have to. The way she stopped looking at me like an outsider and more like someone who belonged there. The way she started waiting for me after long days, sitting in the kitchen with 2 mugs of coffee instead of just one. One night, after an exhausting fundraiser event, we sat on the couch in the penthouse, both too tired to move. Camille leaned her head back against the cushion and sighed. "You know, when I first agreed to this, I thought it was going to be hell." I turned my head to look at her. "And now?" She smirked, but there was something softer in her expression. "Still kind of hell." I chuckled. "But," she hesitated for a second, then exhaled, "but I was wrong about you." I had no idea why that hit me the way it did. Maybe because, for the first time, it felt like Camille actually saw me, not the billionaire, not the businessman, not the calculated strategist, just me, and that terrified me more than anything ever had. Because I knew, without a doubt, that I wanted this to last. But there was still one thing left unfinished. The bet. Richard had not brought it up in months. But I knew it was only a matter of time before he did. And when he did, Camille would find out. She would realize that, no matter how much things had changed, this all started as a game. And I could not lose her over that. So, the next morning, I woke up before she did, made coffee, and sat down at the kitchen table, staring at my phone. I needed to tell her the truth. Not after the 6 months were up. Not when someone else forced the conversation. Now. Because if I had learned anything from Camille, it was that real change did not happen in silence. It happened when you made a choice. And I was finally ready to make mine. Life has a way of challenging the things we think we know about success, about control, about love. Sometimes, we build walls so high that we forget what it feels like to truly connect with someone. But real change happens when we step outside our comfort zones, when we allow ourselves to see the world through someone else's eyes. Camille taught Alex that life is not just about winning, it is about meaning, about purpose, about doing something that matters. So, ask yourself, are you living to prove a point? Or are you living for something real? Because the moment you choose truth over pride, everything changes.